Let's turn now to observing and assessing Australia's potential processes and outcomes that we might need to mitigate or to adapt to. And then we'll start talking about specific governmental organizational responses in the US and Australia, specifically the military side of things. So let's go ahead and get started. But when we talk about natural disasters, last week we talked about the risk of forest fires and raising sea levels in Australia. And what we can see here from just this map from the Bureau of Meteorology, there is some regional variation in where one of those disasters, forest fire risk, is higher than others. And this has an effect on where people decide to live, what kind of building regulations are appropriate, as well as what trends this might require us to be able to have some kind of way of adapting or to try to mitigate the risks of these things getting worse over time. There's been a couple of efforts at the national level to try to understand, to observe and assess what's going on and to be able to develop a policy for it. There's the National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy from the Australian government from 2021 to 2025. I think it also is interesting showing how much a lot of these reports do rely on the published science that we've been reading some of over the course of this term. And you can see how a lot of these issues interrelate to each other in these reports as well as in the literature itself. Adaptation goes hand in hand with actions to reduce emissions, which would be mitigation. And they talk about adaptation and mitigation there in defining their terms before they start talking about more substantive plans for becoming more resilient over the next decade. Also, I think what's interesting from this report is the fact that they also have a similar kind of life cycle approach, but in understanding how to develop resilience to be able to mitigate and to adapt to these kind of changes. It involves understanding a holistic interaction of different terms and issues, the natural world, the social world, the built infrastructure that we have, as well as the economic institutions, and public and private sector interactions to us. And you see the ways in which these things can be interacted, how water resources can affect health and well-being, how utility networks can in turn also affect what makes economic behaviors more profitable or not profitable. All of these things can be connected in your research questions or how you think about these different topics. But a lot of these broad responses have to try to weigh how to spend scarce resources to either mitigate or to adapt. And so you have these overall background conditions. The difficulty, of course, when you're trying to observe and assess is to try to play in your head what is practical, what is feasible politically, economically, environmentally. It's a tough kind of challenge across all of these different levels of analysis. And you can see the top polluters. We are not the worst in the world. China and the US and the EU are, but we are number 18. We pollute more than the state of California, which has maybe at least 10 or 15 million more people, and we also have a lot more geographical area, but we are a bit worse than Italy, France, and Poland individually. And you can see how these things can change. So this is a snapshot over time of current polluters as of 2021 when this report came out. But then also you can see quite dramatic changes over time. On the left, you see how much of emissions have changed overall, different types of emissions over the last 5 decades. And on the right, you can see how different countries' contributions to these elements have changed over time. So observing and assessing what the size and scale of the problem is also includes trying to understand where the system has come from and what elements are contributing more or less to the problems that you're challenging. The huge increase in economic development of China over the last couple decades, you see them skyrocketing since 2000. Of course, they have leveled off in the last decade or so as mitigation efforts have really ramped up. The US has also kind of stayed flatlined. EU has declined more rapidly. India has grown quite dramatically, not dramatically as China. So you do see ebbs and flows by different parts of the system in contributing to the issues, which can lead to policy responses. And you can look at this in a number of different ways. This is another graph from Our World in Data looking at how over a longer time span the size and scale of these CO2 emissions have increased, as well as the different relative contributions over time, how they've changed, how Asia and China have increased relative to North America or Europe over the last couple of decades. And we've seen in the class how there's been tension between those that contributed more to emissions in the past, how much should they be responsible for helping the globe mitigate or adapt, versus those that are contributing more recently that haven't benefited as much from these pollutions. Also, you can see how this also contributes on a per capita basis, and how Australia is that deeper kind of red. Per capita in Europe is less dark than Canada, the US, Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Australia. And you can see that little dark red one in the west coast of Africa. That would be Equatorial Guinea with their resource production there. This is not to say that those larger kind of trends can't reverse themselves. We do see on a per capita emission basis in the last couple of decades, Australia has come down, US has come down, UK has gone down, while those other countries like China, Brazil, and India have increased, though those developed countries are often much more high, at a higher level still on a per capita basis than others. And when it comes down to where these things come from, of course, it does depend on the market. We talked about natural resources several weeks ago, and it should come to no surprise that one of the contributing factors would be coal production. We produce more on a per capita basis here as of 2020 than any other country in the world by a wide margin. Kazakhstan, South Africa, and Russia, China come a distant second through fifth. But that production is a function of both where the resources are. Australia produces a lot more than the US and Russia, although the proven reserves are noticeably less. Australia has less than 2/3 of what the U.S. has in proven reserves, though there's more restrictions in the production in the U.S., while Australia has kind of moved in a different direction. Where we also produce our energy is also, I think, relevant as well. By fuel type, you can see coal energy consumption is actually reduced in the last 15 years or so. Oil still not quite as much as coal. Gas and renewables have actually stayed pretty consistent over the last couple decades, though that is shifting depending on what kind of graph you look at. But this is a way just to try to look at a couple of economic measures, production measures, what is the size and scale of the iceberg that's out there, and to what extent is human behavior kind of contributing to build it, and then that can shape what kind of policies to be able to mitigate or to adapt to those kind of situations, which kind of leads me to the end of this brief section and my section lecture question. I have a couple of videos after this one looking at the US and Australian cases. I think to connect to the Australian case right now, there's a brief video looking at mentioning Australia's Defence Force Chief Angus Campbell's talking about the major threat to national security that climate change poses. I'd be interested to see if you can respond, what the threat he outlines is, what's a response he thinks would be necessary, and do you agree with that assessment and policy response? Why or why not? Turn to that in those videos, and then we'll start with the next section looking at Australian mitigation efforts.